I will present a study we are just conducting currently on Poland on the impact of minimum wage on Polish labor market. And as I have put in the title, it is not really an impact on the labor market, because that would suggest that we also look on the wage distributions, things like that. We look more on the employment effects. So considering what previous speakers said, this is kind of like a narrow approach, and but we are not obsessed, like Andrea said, that there is a branch of literature which is obsessed with employment effects. It is rather the contrary. I'm very deeply puzzled by the fact that there are basically no studies of impact of minimum wage on Polish labor market, especially considering the trajectory that you see on this slide. Between 2000 and 2007, the minimum wage in Poland was in general indexed with inflation. So in real terms and in the relation to the average wage, it was either flat or decreasing. Then in 2007, it changed. I'm not really sure if you can think about it as a change in the system of setting up the minimum wage, but in a way it was something like that. To those of you who don't know the system, or to those of you who don't really pay attention a lot to the minimum wage setting in Poland, it has to be agreed by the tripartite commission, which means by unions, employers, and the government. But the truth is that basically there was never an agreement. So when there was never an agreement in 2000, 2001, 5, 6, and or whatever, then the government was increasing the minimum wage only by inflation. Then the approach changed in 2007 a little bit, and there is, you might remember, the Prime Minister Andrzej Lepper, who is now out of the model, but he once said that every Pole should earn at least the average wage. So, and there was, in a way, maybe not literally translated into the legislation, but there is this rule that as long as the minimum wage is not at the level of 50% of the average, it should be increased by inflation plus 2/3 of the GDP growth, if I remember correctly. If I made a mistake, please correct me. So this is a real weight of indexation. It is not binding in that sense that it doesn't have to be done, but it should be done. And since then, the result, let's say the setting has changed, and you can see that since 2007 till 2014, the minimum wage in real terms, because this is adjusted for inflation, so the minimum wage in real terms has increased by 500 zlotys in Poland, which in real terms is by 50%, by nearly 50% of the 2007 level, and in relation to the average wage, it has increased by about 11 percentage points. So this is a huge change, and what we want to do is to try to look how it affected the employment levels, total in particular groups, and also some other issues. But we don't focus on wage distributions and inequalities, things like that. It's only employment. That slide shows you that the share of the people who are earning less than the minimum wage or the minimum wage and are employed full-time has been correlated with that relation, with that proportion of the minimum wage to the average somehow. When the minimum wage in relation to the average was declining, 2004, 5, 6, that bite was declining, then it was increasing, and in 2010 not so much, but 11 and 2012 is the highest coverage, let's say, of the minimum wage ever. So the share of people who were earning less than the minimum wage or the minimum wage was about 11-12%. Also, as we all know, the labor force survey in Poland is not the best source of information on earnings. There is a substantial non-response, and the distributions are rather different than the distributions of wages we get from Structural of Earnings survey. But actually, this slide shows that once it comes to studying the bottom of the distribution, the minimum wages, it correlates very nicely with the household budget survey. So we will use both these data sources here for the studies. Why we don't use the structure of earnings survey? There are two reasons. Why is that there are no companies employing less than 9 workers in Polish case, which is a huge loss of a sample for that kind of study. And there is another important issue. As we talked a lot about it yesterday, minimum wage is not binding for civil law contracts. And in the structure of earnings survey, we have only the earnings of people who have employment contracts. So if a worker is, if the worker stops working as with an employment contract and gets a civil law contract, he's out of the structure of earnings survey. So it's in a way tautological that there are not many people who are earning below the minimum wage in the structure of earnings survey. Let me move to this slide describing briefly what we do from the methodological viewpoint. So we use the labor force survey data. We have a yearly panel for the entire period that I have just shown on the previous slide. It's 2001-13. We focus on people who are under 55 years of age, so 55. Why? Because 55 plus, there are lots of outflows to inactivity, which are not really driven by wage levels, but rather by the availability of early retirement benefits and things like that. So it's better to focus on the, let's say, youth and prime age. Moreover, we are also working on some double checking if the results hold, or using the household budget survey data, but it's not here on this presentation yet. And we do propensity score matching to identify the treatment group and the treated group and the control group. So we use personal characteristics, job characteristics, and firm characteristics. And then what I will show are the ATTs, so the average treatment effect on those who are actually treated, and we focus on what are the differences in transitions of workers who are between the minimum, who are earning between the 80% of the minimum wage in the current year and the minimum wage level in the year after. So this is our treated group, and our control group are people who are earning a little bit more than this future minimum wage, that the next year minimum wage. And we focus on transitions both from employment out of the employment, in unemployment or out of the labor force, but we also focus, and you should not be surprised considering the yesterday topic, we also focus on the transitions of workers from temporary to permanent jobs and from permanent to temporary jobs. So let me begin with a total effect. Let me begin with the total effect. That's what the obsessed literature would probably agree, that there is an impact of the minimum wage increase on the probability of losing a job by the people who are affected by the increase. The probability of remaining employed is by about 5% lower than those who are earning currently above the future minimum wage. So they are not affected by the spike. What is perhaps interesting here, that the impact is lower in this 2007-2012 period. So even though the minimum wage has been increasing year by year in that period, we kind of find that because of the overall labor market situation being in general a bit better in 2007-12 than in the first part of the period studied, the impact is a bit lower. Now let me move to the impacts on two groups of workers, which we distinguish between permanent workers and temporary workers to begin with. And you won't be surprised that there is a substantial difference between the impacts of the minimum wage increase on the probability of remaining employed by those who have permanent contracts and temporary contracts. So people with temporary contracts are much more likely to lose a job after the minimum wage increase than those who are permanent employed. which is obvious, but it's nice to have numbers and see that they are statistically significant. We also have you also can notice then that there is a difference between both subperiods, which is maybe against the intuition. Now, once we focus on the workers with permanent contracts, once we focus on workers with permanent contracts, you can see that those who are treated by the minimum wage increase have a statistically significantly higher probability of getting a temporary job instead of a permanent job next year. They also have higher risk of outflow out of employment, but this transition into temporary employment is something I would like to stress here. And then when we change the focus and focus only on the workers with temporary contracts, you can see that there is, again, a substantial difference between the probability of getting a permanent job for those who are temporarily employed and affected by the minimum wage increase and those who are not. Interestingly, in the second sub-period that we are studying, it basically disappears. But when you look at the descriptive statistics, then you find that it is not because the probabilities of transition from permanent to temporary jobs for those affected by minimum wage increases decline in the second period. It is because these probabilities of losing of moving from permanent to temporary jobs in the second part, they increase substantially for people who are above the minimum wage as well. So these groups become more homogeneous in that sense that they have higher probabilities of flowing into temporary employment. So the minimum wage increase is not that important in the second period for these transitions, at the fact that they have generally increased. But still, you can also see that, which is probably obvious, but we can see that it is statistically significant, and that the estimated effects are higher than for the permanent workers. There are much higher probabilities of a transition out of the employment for those who have temporary. When we focus on socio-demographic characteristics like gender, age, and education, what I will show you now, we find out that the impact for women is slightly stronger than the impact for men, and at the same time, women constitute majority of minimum wage earners in Poland. On the average, it's 62%. And what is also interesting that the higher age group you study, the more women-dominated it becomes. So among the 15-24 group, it is more or less even, but among the 45-55, it's like 75% are women, and the impact of them is stronger. You can also notice here that even though there is a discussion in Poland that the situation of tertiary education graduate is very bad, that it has deteriorated and so on, still relatively to less educated workers, the tertiary education graduates are in a quite good position on the labor market. There are very few of them who are affected by the minimum wage, who are earning the minimum wage are affected by minimum wage increases. I will return to the education on the next slide, and I would like to show the impact on the age. This is again in line with the so-called obsessed literature, that the impact is stronger for youth, and it decreases. I mean, the impact is slower the impact decreases with age for each consecutive age group. Let me show you the results for educational attainment. The results for educational attainment, yes, there is an impact of people with tertiary education, which seems quite high, but there are very few people with tertiary education who are actually affected by the policy. So it is not that important. What's the most numerous group of people who are affected who are earning up to the minimum wage in Poland? They have basic vocational education, and for them the impact is relatively low, which might be surprising, but for them it is relatively low. It is also post-secondary and secondary vocational. They are also quite numerous. They constitute the second highest share of those who are earning the minimum wage in Poland. For them the impact is stronger. The group with with the biggest impact is people with general secondary, so in Polish it's liceum. So the people with general and secondary have almost triple the size, the effect of basic vocational. They constitute about 12% of all the minimum wage earners. And to give you more intuition what might be happening here, I'd like to show this graph. These are just the average wages. So we don't really control on individual characteristics here, but this is a comparison of what are the average incomes from work, I would say, between incomes from paid work, between people who are on an employment contract and the people who are on a civil law contract, in particular on umowa zlecenie. So you can see that, and the people with general secondary education, in particular males, are the people who have a biggest difference between the incomes from work of both groups. And you can see that the average income from work by people who are working on civil law contract with general secondary is consistently below the minimum wage level. The caveat, we are not able to control for hours here, so some of them might be working short hours. Anyway, there is something in the air. So let me sum up this employment impact, that the increase of the minimum wage in Poland, even though it was very high in terms of in monetary terms and in the relation to the average wage, so far has a modest impact on total employment, but we find some substantial impact on particular groups like youth, and we find an impact on transition between temporary and permanent jobs, which, considering that the civil law contracts are not covered by the minimum wage, I think it's a topic for discussion to merge these two topics, which are crucial for policy, but so far kind of discussed with no relation to each other. Also, we find out that the timing of minimum wage increases in Poland, the timing was quite fortunate, because it really overlapped with much better situation on the labor market that we would expect, seeing that 2008 there is a Lehman Brothers collapse, there is a financial crisis, and so on. But in a way, we were helped out of the mess by the direct transfers from the EU. The other question is what would happen in, let's say, next crisis. And on the other hand, if you remember the slide shown by Herwig on the first presentation, when you look at low-skilled people, then this relation between the wage, the wage of those who earn up to minimum wage and those who earn above the minimum wage is relatively low. So there is a compression of earnings of low-skilled people, not that far from the minimum wage level. So perhaps if we repeat the study, if the transition of increases, if the path of increases is being implemented in the future in line with the trends from the last few years. So perhaps in a few years we'll find different results, perhaps stronger. And finally, the last slide, because I don't want to look at that I'm as obsessed with employment effects as Andrea might think. I would show you just the distribution of minimum wage earners by the equivalized income decile distribution of the entire population. So how to read the slide is just what is the percentage of people, how the people who are earning the minimum wage are spread across the income distributions, the equivalized income distribution in Poland. And you can see that, especially in 2012, after this series of increases, and also by another phenomenon that I will mention in a second, you can see that the share of people who are earning minimum wage and are actually poor is relatively low. That share is less than 20%. It's 17%, if I remember correctly, and it's exactly the same share. It is exactly the same number of people who are earning up to minimum wage and are poor, like the number of people who are earning the minimum wage and are in the 30% of the most affluent households. So currently the minimum wage is earned by the people who are mainly in the middle of the income distribution. So probably the potential of reducing in-work poverty or overall poverty with the minimum wage is relatively low here, or I would ever say that it's very small. And at the same time, the other studies that we do, and I think that it will be discussed in the second session on inequalities, show that over the last few years, the poverty was to larger and larger extent determined by how many people in the household work, rather than the fact how much they earn. This is the slide that I showed yesterday, that the overlap between the low wage earners and the minimum wage earners is relatively low. So perhaps we can think about the minimum wage in Poland in terms of fair labor standards, or rather than think about it as a poverty remedy tool. And that's all, and thank you very much. And yes, so this is, I mean, like I said yesterday, the last conference in Poland which started on time was in 1998. So this is the first session that finished on time since 2002. So I would like to invite you for a coffee break, a short one, 15 minutes, and then let's convene again for the next two presentations, which will have a broader interest than just Europe. Thank you.